So you all are stuffing faces as we get ready to begin, and that's wonderful. Let me welcome everyone here today to our Lunch and Learn session. First, let me recognize some special guests we have with us today. Well, actually, all of you all are special. We just have some folks in city government leadership that are here. First, City Council President Zach Klein. Council President Klein, thank you for coming. I do want to thank everyone for coming today. It is really means a lot to us and to our office. But today, it's all about compassion, and that's what we have been able to show is compassion. And our office mantra is not only creating a community for all, but also to create a true community for all, we have to be compassionate in our work. So I'll call on our commissioner now to come and introduce our panel. We thank you so very much for joining us today, and sit back and enjoy a wonderful time. I see you all are eating, and I plan to join you right now. Commissioner.
Thank you, Director Anderson. Good morning, and welcome to the May 13th Community Relations Commission Lunch and Learn series on compassion. As mentioned, my name is Allison, and I will be moderating. It is with great excitement that I introduce our topic today, victims of crime. Prior to our panel introducing themselves, I would like to thank Gail Gray for the food, and as well, as already mentioned, the CRC staff. With no further ado, I am pleased to ask the panel to introduce themselves, identify which agency they represent, and familiarize the audience with what your agency does regarding assistance to crime victims. Michael.
Hello, audience. My name is Bruce Adams. I'm a retired, happily retired individual. After I've spent almost 30 years of my life working in crime victim advocacy. And in that role, I have been a law enforcement officer. I have been a mental health counselor doing therapy. I have been a crisis response officer. And I've also done many years in both the Attorney General's office and in the crime victims correctional system. The juvenile correctional system in the Office of Victim Services. So that's kind of what I bring to the panel today. And I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Bruce. Welcome. Terry?
Hi, my name is Terry Nooney Green, and I am the creator of the presentation Think, Make, Live, which is motivation to empower self-development, community engagement, and social justice. And what I bring to the table, I am, as an empowerment expert, I empower people to overcome the challenges and barriers of being a victim of crime. I speak to people and motivate them to overcome the stigma of being a victim of crime.
Thank you, Terry. Janine?
Hello, everyone. My name is Janine Stokes, and I work with Impact Community Action, a nonprofit. We work with those who are low income and they might need financial assistance. Also, those re-entering the workforce for whatever reason, life circumstances. Most of our participants happen to be victims of crime or have experienced it in some type of capacity. But my own background is in social work. I have a master's from Ohio State, so I've done plenty of counseling and intervention crisis work also.
Thank you, Janine. Michael?
Good morning. I'm Michael Sheeline with the Ohio Attorney General's Office, the Crime Victims Section. And primarily what we do is we administer the state's Crime Victim Compensation Program, which is a program that can do individual compensation to help offset some of the, the costs that go along with crimes that are committed. We also have on-staff victim advocates, as well as we provide a lot of training and technical assistance to programs that serve victims of crime. And then we also grant out roughly $90 million statewide every year to programs like domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers, prosecutor-based victim advocacy programs, and human trafficking programs.
Thank you, Michael. Judge Peoples?
Hi, my name is Andrea Peoples, and I am a judge in Franklin County Municipal Court. That is the misdemeanor court. You may see us setting bonds for felonies, but we deal with everyday people and their contact. My contact with people that are classically classified as victims are that we have a huge population coming through, victims of domestic violence, assault, menacing by stalking, all of those types of crimes where we have victim advocates and support available in the court. My background is I started off as a public defender, but I was also a prosecutor and was in the first group that started training the officers a little bit more on how to collect evidence, how not to re-victimize victims, and things along those lines. I was in the special victims prosecution also when I was in the county prosecutor's office. So what I bring to the table is I see victims at the point of crisis every day.
Thank you all so much and welcome. Before we go any further, I'd like to ask Council President Klein to address the audience.
Well, how y'all doing? Well, thank you for taking the time to be here and allow your expertise to be shared with us. I'm Zach Klein, President of Columbus City Council, and we're working every day, not only with our safety forces, but with resources with municipal court to ensure that public safety personnel and victims of crime, we're playing our role as a city. And I know that clearly that you all are passionate about this in your service areas, and we want you to know that we're here to work with you. And we appreciate the advocacy that you do because we need to have an outward-facing community process that not only deals with the victims of crime that naturally come because a suspect is arrested or a defendant is charged, but all those victims for the crimes that are unsolved. And that we don't allow them to fall through the cracks because they exist and they need equal amount of help just because the defendant is not charged or caught. So together, I think we can collectively make a difference, and I appreciate CRC and the panel doing what you're doing. Thank you.
At this time, I think we'll just jump into the meat and potatoes of the panel. As we mentioned, our overlying topic is compassion, yet we're talking about victims of crime. So I'd like to pose the question, does compassion play a role in what you do in assisting victims of crime? And that's an open question.
Well, I'll take it. I think everyone has to have compassion in their heart to make it through their day. What I found very challenging in my job is that I'm not supposed to be emotional. I am the court. I am supposed to listen to the facts and I'm supposed to make decisions. So once I put on the black robe, I have to put the compassion in check, but that doesn't mean that I can't be empathetic, that I can't understand what people are saying to me and why they're saying it to me. But I have to keep my compassion, I have to keep my beliefs in check when I'm wearing that robe. So it's very, very important to me to educate people on how to support the people when I have to play the role that I've been elected to do, because compassion is key in getting any and everyone through the process that brings them in front of any of us.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would like to speak on that too. Compassion does play a big role in the part that I play in as an empowerment expert because I actually speak and talk to people that are victims of crime and don't know how to get out of those situations, don't know how to get away from being the prey of the victim, of the crime. And so some of the victims don't realize that once they become a victim, some of them actually learn how to victimize from being a victim. And so as an empowerment expert, the things that I do as far as compassion is understand that I've been experienced as a victim of crime myself. And so it plays a heavy role on me to actually inspire and motivate these people to overcome feeling like you are a prey to the crime that created you a victim.
Thank you, Terry. Any other comments? No? Okay. Can we talk briefly about the aftermath of a crime that a victim may experience in their processing and dealing with their crisis?
I would like to help with that one.
Thank you.
I think that this is a very important issue. In as much as is going to be said today, everything's important, but I think to understand what the basis of criminal victimization is, that it is a critical incident and it begins a crisis. And one of the things we know is that you can't expect people who have just been victimized in, let's say, the last 24 hours, to be experiencing and expressing the same concerns as someone 6 months later. What we know is that victims go through a process, and it's simply called a crisis stage, the stages of crisis. And I'd like just to bring out 3 points real quickly. One is that I doubt if any of you today, when you woke up, maybe had your first cup of coffee or tea or your Mountain Dew, you went into the mirror and you looked at it and you peered at yourself and you said, you know, today is Friday, it is the 13th, and I'm going to be a victim of fill in the blanks, rape, murder, assault, whatever crime you may think of. Did you do that? No, you did not. Because being a victim is something that we do not expect to happen in our normal daily lifestyle. It's not there. And Terry and I were talking earlier before the panel started. It was, sometimes we get critical and we say, you know, why do these people continue to be victims? The issue becomes is we all bring a certain sense of who we are, and we bring our own tool set that allows us to cope and allows us to make choices. Some have a fuller tool chest than others. And the primary thing is the coping skills, the ability to cope with that crisis or critical incident that caused you to be a crime victim. That's the first thing I'd like to say. They don't all react the same. The second thing I need to say is that if you're not aware of what the basic 3 stages of crisis are, please look it up. That's the beauty of today's technology. You can look it up and Google it, crisis reaction, and you'll see there's at least 3 stages. And because of the brevity that I have to talk about this, I just want to identify that it's impact, recoil, and reorganization. Now there's other terms for those, but that's the primary. And quickly then let's talk a little bit about what each of those mean. Impact is pretty simple. It's the initial response of that individual to that critical incident. It's that person's response to what has just happened to them. So when you filled that blank when you were looking in the mirror, whatever happened to them, they are reacting to that. And that is what the impact is. It's basically saying that normal life has been interrupted. Normal life has been interrupted. Even if you're coming from one of those crime-ridden areas of the city of Columbus, you are still going to be reacting to that particular incident that just happened to you. And I think it's very important that we remember that. The other parts of what the impact does is that it shows primarily, but not entirely, shock. People are in shock. You've all seen it, and probably some of you on really simple matters. You wake up in the morning and you think to yourself, you know, today I just want to have a fried egg. And you're just waking up and you're sipping your cup of coffee and you pull the egg out of the egg holder. And oh my golly, on your way over to the skillet, guess what? It slips out of your hand. And what's it do? It hits your floor. And what's it do? It breaks. That's what we're talking about, that reaction. Even a simple matter of breaking that egg, how do you feel? Yeah. First it's a shock, then you go, oh, how stupid am I? Why did I do that? Now I got to clean this up and I'm going to be late for work. And you get the drift? Okay. But it also brings an array of other feelings and emotions. It can be sadness. It can be anger. It can be self-projection and guilt. It can be a lot of different emotions and a lot of different traits, such as loss of appetite, the inability to sleep, just the constant question of asking, why did this happen to me, and what do I do? Because nobody has a script on how to be a crime victim. Nobody wakes up one day and says, you know, I'm going to learn everything there is to know about being a crime victim, so when it happens to me, I'll know what to do. We just don't, because guess what? It's not supposed to happen. Okay. And the final thing I would say to you is this, that at that point, the process begins for the victim to return to normal. As soon as that happened, now we're trying to get back to normal. What I was like before the egg broke. Okay. The recoil piece, that's where the victim is just continuing to struggle with the whole crisis and the whole sense of how this happened to me and when will it end? When will these feelings end? And it goes back and forth. Again, we didn't have a script. We don't know. And that's where it's really important to have assistance, counseling, therapy, those who know what this process is to help those who may need it. That's why it's so important as a community to ensure that those programs exist and those individuals exist in that community. And finally, part of recoil is flashbacks. The whole idea that, why don't you just get over it? Just get over it. I'm sorry your mother was murdered in a robbery. Just get over it. It's been 8 months. Well, you've got human beings who are still flashbacking or going back to that day when the police officer came to the door. I'm sorry, Miss Smith, I have to tell you that your mother has been murdered. Can I come in? Or I need to tell you something about your mother. However they're going to do that notification, that flashback, and then the ongoing process from that time on. So that's the whole issue of recoil. Those memories come back. So it's hard to just get over it. Finally, reorganization is the whole idea that we can reorganize the pattern of our life to get back to normal. But all of you probably know is that you may not be able to get back to normal. If I'm Miss Smith and a police officer knocked on my door and notified me that my mother had been killed in a robbery, what did I lose? I lost my mother, and it'll never be normal again. And I just heard a young lady in the audience say, near normal. Exactly. So what we try to do from that point then is to try to get back to near normal, as close as we can get back to where we were with our life. And really, what you just heard me say is, I look forward to the question coming up, which is, as family and community members, how can we help? And I think you're going to find this panel full of ideas to help you so that if that does happen to you or a loved one, you'll have some tools in that toolbox to carry on. Thank you.
Thank you.
About what I see as far as when the victims are in crisis, the beginning of dealing with it. You talked about mentally, physically, emotionally. What that looks like when you're in court, you've just been through this. An officer who you don't know has told you as a victim you need to be in court to request your temporary protection order. Perhaps the person that assaulted you took the keys. How are you going to get there? What are you going to do with your children? Can you go back to your home? Where are you supposed to live? Is he going to remain in jail? Is he going to be released? Is the threat over? What are all the things these are all the things that are running through your head while you're standing in front of me, and I'm asking you to testify to tell you whether I'm going to give you a protection order. You're thinking about where your next meal is coming from. You're thinking about how to find clothes for your children, and I'm asking you to relay the facts in a clear, concise manner so I can determine whether you qualify for a protection order. So victims of crime are going through a lot of things, and that's why all of these people are so important, that there are the supports there so that while some person's doing their job, the emotional, physical trauma side of it is not being ignored. It's all of those things. It's crying, it's anger, it's not wanting the protection order because I'm not a victim. You're not going to call me a victim. I'm a person. Don't class me. So it's someone that needs one but tells you I don't want one, and needing to understand what level of the recoil they're going through, what their normal or near normal is that they're trying to get back to if they've been through this so many times that it doesn't faze them the way you expect it to. So when you see these things, as he was saying, it manifests itself in so many different ways. Anger, fear, anything. I actually had someone actually physically nauseous because of all the things that were going on at one time.
When you, obviously you hear frequently directly from victims. Are there times when you feel as though the justice that they're seeking is probably not attainable? And how do you see the system working to try to explain that in a way that the victim will understand it? Maybe not accept it, but understand it.
One of the very best things about my job are the victim advocates. Because before you come into my court to ask for that, you've met with someone that's trained to talk to you about crisis, to talk to you about safety planning, and to give you some realistic expectations. We're a very get it over with quickly type of society, but charges working through the system take a while. There's the arrest, there's the arraignment, there's the pretrial, there's perhaps a second pretrial, there's the jury trial. So during that time, we try to make sure that they have access to victim advocates that speak whatever language they speak, that are aware of whatever culture they're coming from, to explain to them what their options are while they're working through this. And I always try to explain to everyone that the law is a bit like, there's a biblical tale where we're going to split the child in half because the law says what we do is divide this, and if you actually care for that child should not be dead. Someone should back down and say, this is something I love. But the law is about dividing that baby because that's what the law is. It's being able to give the people the support around the law so that they can actually get the outcomes that they need, and just explaining again as many times as they need to hear it, and in as many ways that they need to hear it, how to get from point A to point B. Not A to Z. You have to do it one step at a time, and you have to be patient to get people to want to get from point A to B and then be around for C later on.
Can I add to that?
Please do, Tim.
So I want to add to the fact that there are some people that are born into this world as a victim of crime. See, there's some people that don't even have the before. See, when a young person is born as a crack baby or born inside of prison. See, I speak inside of prisons, and there are a lot of population of women that were victims of crime because of the spouse or the boyfriend that they were with, and then they became a victimizer of crime. And not only did they become a victimizer of the crime that they were a victim of, but now they're a victimizer because they're giving birth to a child that's becoming a victim of crime, and they don't even know it. See, some of these young people or young kids are being born inside of the prison walls, being born inside of crack houses, or being born inside of, poverty, that they don't even know that they're a victim of that crime. So when you talk about the mental, physical, emotional, the infants that are born into this world not knowing the difference between being a victim or not being a victim is something that's very important to a lot of people that are victims of crime.
Thank you, Terry. Janine?
Speaks personally on this question, the question being the aftermath of crime. So myself, I witnessed it. You, Mr. Bruce, you brought up, your mother was murdered, get over it. Well, that speaks directly to me. My mother was murdered by my own father. I'm okay with speaking about it. It was years ago. I've dealt with it, well, the best that I can, I believe. And so I just remembered, and it still happens, like the flashbacks. I'm now 27. This happened when I was 6. I was there, I seen it. And I even still speak with my dad. So the first thing, I still remember this. I'm thinking, like, is this real? Am I really looking at my mother bleeding from her neck? Am I really seeing this? And so when I go on to college and I decided I want to do social work because I want to be able to spill my compassion into people and let them know, like, you don't have to use your, whatever it was that you're experiencing as a crutch. You don't have to hold that and say, this is the reason why I can't be great. This is the reason I don't have my mother. I don't have this, I don't have that. you can rechannel it into a space where you can say, I'm doing this in honor of that person, or in honor of this situation, or in honor of other people who are also experiencing it. So just thinking about, what can I have done? Even still, like, what if I would have went upstairs 10 minutes earlier? Like, what if I would have said something? Or were they mad at me, and was that why they were arguing? Things like that are so real. And then when working with my population today, it don't necessarily have to be so intense of a crime, but it's still real. It's like, you can make your way around this. It's just channeling that and then putting one foot in front of the other.
Thank you, Janine. Michael, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think also there's a lot of times the practical things that have to be worked with as you're going through this crisis. I'm sure most people are familiar with the events in Pike County that our office has been a part of investigating. And I was down there a couple of weeks ago meeting with the family, and one, realizing they're in shock over this terrible event that has happened. But on top of that, this has happened to you. You have investigators asking questions. You have the press there, which happens a lot of times in homicides. You have the families, 4 different pieces of the family's property secured. You have to plan funerals. You have to worry about how are we going to pay for all of the things that need to be paid for, and at the same time just do the basic necessities on a daily basis. And I was just kind of struck by the enormity after this happened, whether it's 8 members of one family or it's just a survivor of one family member. There are so many things that you have to work through and get through on top of taking care of yourself. And that's why we really do rely heavily on our advocates to help through that process, because it's not just getting through the crisis, which is such, and getting toward becoming a survivor. It's all of those other things that have to be done on a daily basis too, because you're still living.
Thank you. Anything else? No? In your practice as professionals, is there a difference between being empathetic and compassionate?
I would have to say, especially in mine, that there's a major difference. As a judge, if I'm too compassionate to a victim, then I'll be accused of being unfair, being biased towards one party or another party. But there is nothing that says I can't be empathetic, that I can't understand and put myself in both parties' shoes to understand what's being explained to me. So I guess compassion is that natural thing where you want to reach out to somebody that's hurt and make it better. Whereas empathy is trying to understand the information that's being provided to you from their point of view and going forward and using it in the job that I'm limited to when I'm wearing that black robe. So for me, there's a very big difference, but hopefully it gets you to the same place while still maintaining the neutrality necessary to go forward with the laws.
That's exactly where I was going ahead with that question. Empathy, I think, comes from a place of putting yourself in that person's shoes and actually truly trying to feel what they're feeling and what that looks like, how that feels. And then I feel like compassion is something that comes after it. It follows it. It's the immediate response, like what can I do to help? Or what actions can I take afterwards? So they kind of work together at the same time. I just think empathy comes a little, precedes compassion.
Michael, did you have something to say?
Yeah, and I think empathy, trying to imagine what they're going through. Unless something similar has happened, you're not necessarily going to be able to imagine that fully. But I think listening and really trying to place, think about in your own life, if that had happened to me, what would some of my reactions be? And I think it's really important too that it's, being non-judgmental. Because often when something happens to someone, we often like to say, well, why didn't you leave him? Or why were you walking down that street at that time of night? It's important to look at victims and survivors when you're communicating to them is what happened to you, not what's wrong with you or why did this happen, what were the things that you did to let up, which is sometimes a very natural, even sometimes myself will still think in my head, why in the world did you do that? This may have not happened. had you not been in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Terry?
So I would say that empathy to me is hearing out. So being able to hear out what the person has been through or what the person is going through. And compassion plays a role in being able to give advice or being able to nurture or, nurse that feeling of having empathy over what they've been through, whatever crime or whatever tragedy they've been through.
Thank you, Terry. Bruce?
I would throw in one last thought. I think it's very important for those of us in the audience and the community that we live in as individuals in that community, be very aware of the fact that, again, like I said before, we all do not go through crisis the same way. And there are going to be individuals, thousands and thousands and thousands of victims and survivors that I've worked with. There are some who absolutely do not want pity and do not want sympathy. They want what they hope that the honorable judge is going to give them, which is justice. And so I think it's very important to remember that though they're sad, though they're in grief, though they may have all these other arrays of responses to the crisis, the one thing that some of them do not want is pity. And that includes, I'm sorry that happened to you. That's an insult to them. How do you know you're sorry? So you have to kind of read carefully and walk carefully. And later I'll talk to you a little bit about how do you know what to say.
Thank you. Anything else? No? When we talk about walking carefully, when we're interacting with victims of crime, how do we determine or know what their needs are?
Sometimes you can know their needs from just hearing out their story. And a lot of some of the stories that we hear of victims of crime, we done heard in different situations. And just being able to hear out what they've been through. Hearing out, and as you're hearing out, you're actually thinking about some solutions or maybe even some possible resources that they can connect to create some solutions. Because just like he said, there's some people that know they're a victim of crime and they don't want the light to be shined on them, but they do want that help or that guidance to be able to talk to the right person, be in front of the right person that will guide them into a solution to whatever they've been through.
I would agree with Terry. Allowing the person to fully tell their story. Sometimes they start to repeat themselves, and then that's when you notice a motif. Like, what are they reiterating on? What are they reiterating? Somebody help me with the word. What do they keep saying, reiterating on? And when you just keep hearing that, sometimes you just, even the awkward silence is important. Don't interrupt. Let it get it. Something else is deep in there, and it comes out. And then sometimes it's nice to guide them with your questions and like, what would that look like for you? Like, I just want things to be back to what does that look like for you? Open-ended questions. And so when they're able to kind of think of things that way, they can start probably putting pieces together and saying, well, this might be my next step to get to this feeling or this solution.
I think the only thing we know about every victim of every crime is that at some point in time we want them to be a survivor. We don't want them to continue to be a victim, but other than that, it's very individual. And what they were both saying about needing to listen to them, needing to know that particular person in that particular situation is the only thing that you can know a victim needs, because everyone reacts differently. And if you try to peg them into a certain category because this is what worked before, then you're missing what that person really needs. So in knowing what a victim needs someone to listen, someone to consistently be there as they're working through it over the long haul. And if you can't do it all, don't promise them you'll do it all, but promise them what you can do.
Bruce?
I want to quickly point out, I think, Mike, you used this word just a little bit ago. It's not only listening, but it's listening in a non-judgmental way. And I think it's also important to know, I have an old mentor, not old, she's my age. And when I first was coming up through the ranks in victim advocacy, I really struggled with how do you know this question, how do you know what a victim needs? And she looked at me, I wished I had it on YouTube because it would be worth a lot. She looked at me and she stared right in my eyes and she said, "You'll know." And the key, like everyone here on the panel has said, is listening, non-judgmentally, and to have your toolbox in front of you. So you know what resources exist in your community that you can refer to. And Terry's mentioned that, Janine mentioned that, the judge has mentioned that. Mike's going to talk a lot more about that, I hope. But now you're starting to see the whole picture. And so I wanted to make sure that non-judgmental, you heard that again. You can't echo that enough in your mind. You have to listen carefully to what they're saying in a non-judgmental way.
Thank you, Bruce. Michael, what would you like to add?
Well, I think it's important, it's their journey too, and they make the decisions. We want to empower them to make decisions about their life and not have us make decisions that we think are right for them. And it's really got to be at their time and their pace as well. So.
Thank you. So as audiences, friends, family members, what can we do to assist victims of crime?
Well, I'll start because I have pamphlets in the back that I'm hoping each and every one of you are going to pick up, memorize, pass around. The thing that you can do is what you're doing here right now. You're educating yourself. That is the most important thing because we keep talking about having that toolbox. In my world, again, most of the victims are domestic violence, assault, things along those lines. So there are pamphlets in the back that talk about how to help. There's a domestic violence resource pamphlet in the back. There is a guide for family and friends that kind of reiterates some of the things we already talked about listening, about not being judgmental, about being there for what you can actually offer. There's a thicker packet back there that talks about protection orders, how to get them for crimes that are covered by VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. There are protection orders and things that people are entitled to, but this also goes into some of the terms in court. Attorneys are horrible. We all went to school, so we all want to speak Latin so we can show how much better we are than the rest of the world. And sometimes that's really, really confusing. So it has some of the terms that you'll hear when you're down there in court. There's a pamphlet on stalking. There's a pamphlet on understanding the trauma, why it's not going to all happen at one time, why 8 months or 20 years down the line, it's going to manifest itself differently. Something here on civil protection orders, and also that we are not ignorant, that we reach out to different segments of society. So there is, Bravo helps us with the LGBTQI community, and we're also more aware of the cultures. We have a large Somali culture, we have a large Latino culture, so we're also more aware of how the cultural aspects affect. So please, pick up a pamphlet, pick up 2 pamphlets, just happen to have it, read it over, leave it on, well, if someone's actually a victim of crime, do not leave it on their doorstep because their abuser will not be amused by you providing this information. But if it's in your home when they're there, leave it there for them to pick up on their own. So I just say, as family members and friends, if you love someone, keep educating yourself and be there and be patient.
Thank you, Judge. Anybody else?
Well, you know, a lot of these places too, and when I talk a little bit about some of the programs, have websites. And what's nice about those websites is a survivor, a victim can go on those websites and very quickly leave, because one of the things that we're concerned about is when you have pamphlets or when you have different things that talk about how to get to safety, it's not necessarily stuff that a victim can have laying around the house. There are hotlines, there's a number of things. So one thing, if you're aware of what those programs are in the area, you know, what are the hotlines if you suspect you have a friend or family member going through one of these things that you can readily give that to them, and at a safe point in time, they're able to kind of access some of those services or begin what it looks like for them to get out of that particular situation.
Thank you. Bruce?
Just one quick insight. I think it's important to look at a broader perspective, from a historical perspective, if you will. Crime victims hasn't been the top of the heap of concerns for very long. We heard VAWA, that's a Violence Against Women Act, that came out in the 90s. You had the Victims of Crime Act when Ronald Reagan was president in 1984, which was VOCA. And Mike's probably talk a little bit about that. But the broader perspective is that each of you are a community member. And you know, almost every day of a week, there's somebody talking about legislation just down the street. And that legislation may have something to do with crime victims and the law. It is important to remember that how we view those laws will determine how people are treated as victims. And I kind of pride myself in the history of the crime victims movement, I guess because I'm just an old dog and I've been watching it for a long time. But I really encourage you to try to stay attuned to what's happening with that legislation and what's happening so that you can assist. If you think something is a good idea, don't just sit on your hands. Get up and move. Be an advocate. Try to make sure that those ideas are transformed into laws that do help victims. That would be a huge encouragement to me in a broader sense of assisting victims of crime from a historical perspective.
And if I can just touch on that, one of the things for the longest time with things, and I keep coming back to domestic violence because that's the most contact I have, but for the longest time, the mentality with domestic violence was that's a family problem. It stays in the house, you go back home and you work it out. It wasn't until VOCA first and then I'm sorry, I'm using acronyms. The acts that we talked about came along that it went from something where law enforcement would say, go back home and work this out. It's an acknowledgement that violence carries over, that it's not a family issue, that it is violence. There's family issues and then there's violence, and they're not the same thing. So when he's asking you to be an advocate for legislation, that's where you make the difference. Sometimes it takes the laws going forward to make the ways of thinking about things move forward as well.
I want to jump in quickly just to make, again, another point of what she just said. Did you know that in the state of Ohio, there wasn't a domestic violence law until 1978? Did you know that? Did you know that it was not against the law to drive drunk and kill or injure someone until almost 1983? That Mothers Against Drunk Driving was in 1980 due to Candy Leitner out in California and the loss of her daughter in a crash. The point we're trying to make here, I think, is we have to find a role here and be passionate about changing things so that people who are victims are treated appropriately. And I just wanted to make sure, because the historical piece, if you look back, you can track. Can you imagine what it would have been like for a mother of someone whose daughter was killed in a drunk driving crash and there's no law against it? And the person is just going to spend 3 days in jail because they were drunk when they were driving and causing the crash? That was it. That was it. That's all that happened. So I think it's very important to go back to that issue of activism and ensure that you keep your eyes on what's out there. And if you believe that that's going to help, please jump on board.
Terry, from an empowerment standpoint, do you have anything to add?
I do have something to add. Basically, what I want to say is that as a compassion of wanting to help, you got to be aware of your role as a person to helping someone. because some people that tries to help the person that's the victim of crime end up being a victim of the same crime that person is a victim of. So you cannot go into a domestic violence situation and tell that man to stop hitting her, because that man might hit you, you know? And so sometimes as a role of wanting to help, you gotta know how to sit back and not be so forefront about the situation. See, some of us is watching loved ones, family members, and friends be victims of crimes, and it's hurting us. It's hurting us. It's hurting to know that a woman's been in a relationship for over 20 years and she's been beat on, and everybody knows. Everybody knows. So it's like, how do you help that situation? How do you help when you want to help, but you know that your help can't do anything because it might cause you to be a victim of the exact same crime? It might cause you to fear not just the life of the person that you have love for, but fear your life. Because some people speak up in situations and then they don't get physically hurt, but verbally they get hurt or threatened to say, you know, shut up, don't tell me not to do this because I've been with this woman for such and such, she's gonna listen to me. But in your heart, you're like, no, I was born, we was raised together. You know, this is not the person I know, you know? And you watch certain people that become victims of crime for so long turn into a person that you don't even know. A person that you grew to love at a childhood, and you see this tragedy happens in their life, and then they turn into a person because of the prey. They turn into this prey of the victim, the prey of the crime. And, you know, it's just knowing how to react, knowing when to react, and knowing who to react, you know?
And outside of, we'll get to questions in just a few moments. Outside of forums like this, how can we further educate ourselves on knowing how to react, when is a safe time to react in helping victims?
I'll jump in first. I remember being invited in 1985 to the National Institute of Mental Health's consortium on helping crime victims and treating perpetrators. I was one of 20 in the United States. And that question was exactly what was asked. And that's why we were all there. There's an old book by Morton Baird. It's called the Crime Victim Book. Simple enough, Crime Victim Book. If you can read, great. If you can't, it's also available in audio. That is my Bible and has been my Bible. It's written simple enough, but it's full of citations to research, and it gives you some real simple stuff that will allow you to be prepared for what to do when you see a particular, you experience a certain crisis, and how to help family and friends.
Some of the things that I've left back there talk about some of the sources that you can go to. There's something called the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. You can go online, and that way you're not distracting them from helping someone in a trauma situation that's calling in. But there's more pamphlets, there's more direction to classes or seminars or things along those lines. I know that the city attorney's office, their advocates are really, really busy, but even when they're not in court, they will talk to people about safety planning. And if this is not someone that can call on their phone because their abuser is going to check their phone, you could call for them, get this information through the city prosecutor's office. Choices offers information. Some of the mental health facilities, such as Southeast, will offer information and give you further information. I think the Sheriff's Department, I know that they have a stalking unit that has been working with the prosecutor's office, so they have information that you can get through the Sheriff's Department as well.
Thank you. Anyone else?
And for people who can't seem to maybe remember acronyms or big, long titles, I immediately was going to respond to your question by saying, Google it. It's that simple. Google resources for victims, battered women, or anything like that, and you can come up with all these organizations that you can personally investigate and explore on your own and figure out what is the right thing to say or how can I approach the situation.
Thank you. And before we get too far, speaking of acronyms, would somebody take a moment, please, and explain to myself in the audience VAWA and VOCA?
Sure.
Thank you, Mike.
VAWA, or in certain parts of the state, VAWA, is the Violence Against Women's Act. And that primarily, there's a funding source that comes out of that to help programs work with victims of crime and some prevention efforts and training efforts. And then VOCA, which I'm affiliated with, is the Victims of Crime Act. And that was really specifically enacted really from kind of activism and advocates to really make sure that those direct services were provided to victims. And it was really a strong focus on victims healing and becoming survivors. Not so much maybe on collecting data or, some of the other focus of VAWA, or especially not on the prevention area, but directly providing services to those victims of crime.
Mike, can you talk a little bit why that was important, maybe about the trust that victims had, or the lack of trust that victims had in a system, and why that was important?
Well, as Bruce mentioned earlier, this is kind of, really, it is a newer phenomenon to really care about what the victim's needs were. It was just automatically assumed, while justice is very important for most victims, but it was, we're gonna go get the bad guy, punish them if we can, and you're going to help us, And often, the judicial system can be kind of a scary, it can be kind of a scary place if you haven't had a whole lot of interface with it prior, or maybe you have had some experience with the justice system that hasn't been exactly, exciting, promising, healing to begin with. So this really was, there was a need, focus that there were, we always focused on the perpetrator, catching them, going through the justice system and putting them in jail, and then the victim was kind of left. Often, testify, and then it was it. There was no one really to support them. So I think that's kind of, to me, what VOCA was all about. And it really was victim advocates that drove this. It wasn't really, a bunch of legislators that said, hey, let's do this and we can put some money toward it. It was driven by activism.
Victims and survivors.
Yes.
They drove it.
They did.
They were telling victim advocates what we need to do. And that's why that was so important.
And I just have to say, I'm not offended by anyone saying that the court system is scary, because it is. You have to come downtown, you have to find parking, you have to pay for parking, or you have to get a bus to where you're going. You walk in from the parking garage, you're on the 9th floor, but when you get into the building, you're on the 6th floor. You have no idea what building you're in. Just navigating the court system is scary, and I work there. So when they talk about how everything was focused on the defendants or the person that was charged, they're correct. When I get a file on my desk, I call the case number and I look at the name, and the name is the defendant. The name is not, there isn't an extra line where it says, and this was the person that was subject to this alleged crime. It just says, this is the defendant. And it says, this case was assigned to you at this point in time, and you have to have it resolved by this point in time, or it's overtime. So there was definitely a need to remind people that there are other audiences, that crime, for purposes of tracking, is very focused on the defendant, but there are a lot more people involved in a case file than the name on the front. So it's because of the things through VOCA and VAWA that there was this shift to include all the parties in an incident having a right to speak in court.
I think what's important to point out, too, about both of these acts, one, again, in law, there was the acts or the rights of the defendants and due process, which are important. But prior, there was nothing about victims' rights in law. Weren't even really spoke about. And then both of these acts, especially the Violence Against Women's Act, really important to making sure that all victims are served. And that's really important when we talk about, members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans community, and certain cases where women were not getting the services they need, but also acknowledging that in domestic violence, males can be victims as well. It's, that it's primarily females, but there are also male victims. So the Violence Against Women Act has gone a long way to making sure, which is important to our office too, that all victims, regardless of, limited English proficiency, disabilities, deaf or hard of hearing, LGBTQ, we want all victims to be served, and all of our programs should, be competent. It's a journey, but able to serve all victims.
Thank you. Anybody else have anything to say on victims' rights? What are victims' rights?
I would love to. Thank you for asking that question. That is my biggest sense of accomplishment. In 1994, some of you probably even hit the button that day, because we know about 78% of the citizens of Ohio said that we want to have a constitutional amendment for the rights of crime victims in Ohio. What a marvelous day that was for me. I knocked on a lot of doors the 3 months prior, hanging little things, little door hangers, talking about the needs for rights for victims. And that was your voices that said, doggone right, we need to change the Constitution. It can't just be about the defendant. It has to be also about the victim. That was in 1994. But also in 1994, we've always had crime victim laws dispersed in the Ohio Revised Code. But in 1994, then Senator Betty Montgomery, who later became an attorney general, she introduced a bill that put all of the crime victims' laws, rights if you will, into one chapter. And that was chapter 2930 of the Ohio Revised Code. Why? Because what was happening, victims could not find the information they needed to know what their rights were, or even what laws pertained to them. So it was very important in 1994 that victims now became statutorily covered under the Ohio Revised Code, and also in the Constitution of the state of Ohio, which says simply, you got to treat them with dignity and respect and like a human being and not a piece of meat. And I've only used that term because I've heard many victims say, I feel like a piece of meat. Everybody wants me to do everything for them, to tell them what happened to me, but nobody really wants to watch out for what my best needs are. So that's kind of what the crime victims' rights, really when they kicked in, was in 1994. But we've had them since 1972. The first victims' rights law was the right to provide a victim statement. And that was in 1972. It was later followed by another one that said, not only can you provide that statement, but you can also do it prior to a capital punishment case. That was immediately turned by the Ohio Supreme Court due to the emotional status of providing a statement at time of sentencing and how that could possibly cause someone to be sentenced more than they should, let's say simply. So that kind of thing talks about rights of victims.
And I think the way it manifests itself in court is when the domestic violence laws were first enforced and people were filing them, but maybe still had that personal belief about whether it should be a crime or not, that it controlled how much effort was actually spent on getting the victim involved. Now, when I have a domestic violence case, I turn to the prosecutor and I ask, is there a victim statement? I expect that I'm going to hear one, or I'm going to hear from you why there's not a victim statement. So putting it all in one code section, putting it right in front of people meant that they begin trying to contact victims before the case. Means after the case is resolved, my probation department has victim advocates that make sure after the crime is over that there's still someone that can do more safety planning, that there's still someone that can connect them with social services. So by delineating it very clearly, it made sure that the victim is expected to be a part of the case as opposed to maybe they will, maybe they will not. There are questions that are supposed to be asked.
There are 13 laws in Chapter 2930, so if you ever get bored, you can Google it. You can read all the victims' rights laws in Chapter 2930.
Thank you. Judge Peoples, would you mind to speak a little further in regards to victim advocates and what their role is within the court system in helping the victim?
They are the people that can express the compassion that the court is supposed to be holding in check. They are the people that as soon as a defendant is charged with, and I'm speaking of misdemeanors, there's something else that goes on in common pleas, but as soon as a defendant is charged, they're the ones that are trying to get in touch with the prosecuting witness, which is what we call the people, as opposed to calling someone a victim and putting that label on them, we call the person that has been assaulted the prosecuting witness. So they try to get in touch with them to let them know that you have a right to a protection order. This is the court date. Are you available to be here on this court date? Do you have any immediate concerns? This is how it's going to be assigned to a judge. This is how it's going to be assigned to a prosecutor. These are your rights. You can speak to the defense attorney if you want, but please realize the defense attorney is hired to represent the defendant and you're not obligated to. These are telephone numbers. These are resources. This is the safety planning. Don't do this on your computer. Ask someone else to use their phone if you need to look things up. They basically are trained to fill in all the gaps between how the court system works and how their lives are going to be lived during this process. The city prosecutor's office has, I believe, 6 on the floors, and then additional people that are funded by grants in the offices. They help with getting civil protection orders, which are long-term protection orders, can last up to 5 years. They stand next to the victims, they stand next to the prosecuting witnesses in court so that if they're in a small room with their accuser, they're standing between that person and their accuser. They're reminding the court, if I get too busy, they're reminding the court, Your Honor, he's making threatening gestures. Oh, really? Young man, turn, face the wall. Do not face the victim. We need to get through this legal proceeding without me having to increase your bond because you're disrespecting the orders of the court. They're kind of everywhere. We have advocates that speak Spanish so that there's not, if you can't get an interpreter immediately, you can still have an understanding of what the victim statement is if it's written in another language. I admire them. The things that they do, it seems to be anything that you ask them.
There's one other important piece too. Should the individual go to jail, there is a victim notification system so that the victim survivor can sign up for and get notified if there's any change in while they're incarcerated. Even if they were to go to the hospital outside of where they're in lockup, the victim would be notified. If for some reason they would die in jail, the victim would be notified, as well as some hearings that could come up or any kind of movement. And I think that's really an important kind of safety in helping that person heal. They know at all times that that individual is locked up, and if something changes in that, they're going to be notified just prior to that happening. And a victim advocate is very important into helping that individual get signed up for that program called VINE.
Established in 1995.
Yeah.
Our historian.
Another old dog.
Anybody like to add anything in regards to advocacy with victims? Terry, do you have anything? No? Okay. What types of funding streams are available or go towards efforts to help victims of crime?
Well, the one we touched on was VOCA, which is the Victims of Crime Act, and that's a federal funding stream, and that comes from court fees, fines, and settlements. None of that from the federal level are tax dollars. And it incidentally is a very large pot of money. It sits at about $8 to $10 billion every year nationwide. And what's really important is, again, that comes from people that do really bad things or really stupid things. And I like to say we have a lot of corporate sponsorship for that fund, because a lot of that money comes out of those settlements with big corporations who have had unfair consumer practices or price fixing, other things like that. Last year, Ohio got a tremendous boost in the amount of funding. The year before, we roughly had about $15 million. We went up to $65 million this last year. That was a gigantic jump, and it really needed to happen because there certainly was not enough funding out in the state to support the services. So VOCA is one avenue. Then we have a state victims assistance fund, which again comes from state fines, settlements. And then we have the State Rape Crisis Trust Fund, which was enacted by the legislature. And basically locally here, what we fund is going to be the Choices, which is a domestic violence shelter here, SARNCO, which is, let me see, Assault Response Network of Central Ohio.
There we go.
Which is run through Ohio Health, which primarily deals with rape crisis and other types of sexual assault. Salvation Army for human trafficking. We do a lot of work with Judge Herbert at the Catch Court with human trafficking survivors. Children's Hospital, we have a child advocacy center which works with children that have been abused sexually or physically. And then we have some smaller, we fund the City of Columbus and at the prosecutor's office for their advocates. And then we fill some other areas where we really focus on marginalized communities. We fund Bravo, which is focused primarily on the LGBTQ community, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault, or hate crimes. And then we have a few other smaller organizations that deal with deaf and hard of hearing. We have a program through the Ohio School for the Deaf that has more of a local feel to it. A couple of others throughout the city as well. But what's important is we still have a lot of money, and we are looking for new programs. Even though we traditionally will continue to fund all of these basic programs we always have, but it's important to us to make sure we're not missing anyone. And sometimes there is a need for culturally specific programs that may be filling a need that we're not aware of. So to us, please reach out to us and let us know some of the work that you're doing that might touch with crime victims. Often we find there are a lot of different places doing it that we didn't realize outside of what we might look at the traditional programs. We're not looking to duplicate services, we're looking to enhance those services that already exist, and that that community collaboration is very important to us as well. So again, we already fund a lot of programs, but we know we're still missing some folks, and we're also looking for new and innovative ways to work with survivors of violent crime.
Thank you. Terry, did you have something to say? No? Okay.
Actually, this isn't really about funding, but something he mentioned that we haven't talked about, the human trafficking. I always need to remind people that this is a bigger problem than any of you think. You always think it's something that's happening in another country to other people. But 70 and 71, which come right through Columbus, are major highways. The same people that are running truckloads of drugs through Columbus are running truckloads of young girls, young boys, to conventions, to wherever it is that they can sell the sexual services of their victims. So in case we're all still thinking it's something that's happening somewhere else, we have 70, 71, we have a huge problem.
And I'll chime in real quick on that too, because part of our office is a Crimes Against Children unit. And I think if you really realized how many children are being sexually exploited, it's just baffling. And that's one area that we're really looking to work at too. We just recently started funding a couple of shelters in Columbus that deal with unattached or housing unstable youth, Huckleberry House and Star House, because the average age of entry into trafficking is really in the low teens, 12, 13, 14. And it's important to understand it's both boys and girls. And it's not always as organized as we think with a pimp and, a group. It's also parents exploiting and selling their children as well. So you're absolutely right. It is a really huge problem in the city and in the state. And that's another place that if you know of people that are doing work or trying to do outreach, we certainly would like to hear about it.
And I think it's important when we talk about trafficking to remember that its core is oppression. It's very, a lot of times when you look at it, it's so alien to most of us that you can't even grasp what it is. So I look at it as oppression, as if there's something powerful and that a certain group of people want this, and thus it allows it to exist. And so, again, if you don't know a lot about human trafficking, I encourage you, as the other panelists do, to do a little Googling and read about it, because it exists, and it's a much bigger problem than even I knew until a few years ago. So.
Thank you. Anything else on that topic?
I was just going to add that, it's not just sex trafficking, it's organ trafficking. I remember doing a whole entire presentation on that. Well, these young girls think that they're getting this modeling opportunity. You have to get this money, meet us in Paris, or anything like that, and they wake up on a table with a scar right under their arm. The kidney is gone, don't even know it. So the black market is very close to home.
Thank you. Can we have a conversation or share a story with the audience that might better help our viewers understand the effects of crime on a victim?
Yeah, I'm gonna tell a little bit about my story. And so I was actually a victim of my mother's crime. My mother was a drug dealer, and my mother was incarcerated for being creating crime herself, actually, in a lifestyle of selling drugs. And at the time, I was only 15 years old. I was an honor roll student at Independence High School, but I had a disconnection with my father. So I was confused on what to do now that my mom's incarcerated. So I was homeless, living in the streets of Columbus, Ohio, and I became a victimizer of the same crime that my mom committed. I became a victimizer off of what I seen my mom do, and now, I had to live with that. I ended up getting incarcerated, served a 4-year prison sentence because of what I'd done as a victimizer. And now, as an empowerment expert, I actually go back inside of prisons and I motivate and empower people that are victimizers how to get out of that mentality, how to get out of the mental stage of wanting to use drugs, or wanting to abuse people, or want to physically harm people. And some of the people, even the victimizers, are lost, confused on why their lives are who they are. Because a lot of victimizers were victims of crime. A lot of people that I speak inside of prison and talk to and empower them to get out and do something different speak about how their family members or friends are still committing the same crimes that they were involved into. A lot of people have to go and have role models, friends that they look up to that are victims of crime or victimizers of crime. And see, my role plays a very powerful role because I actually got the opportunity to speak in a prison where I served my 4-year sentence. And to go back into that prison and see men that are never coming home, men that has life sentences from being the victimizer and not having or feeling like they have any hope of the change that they want in their lives, not while they're incarcerated, but when they get out of prison. And as an empowerment expert and as what I do, I also speak to young people that are getting bonded over at the age of 17 years old, faced with 40, 30, 50 years. And I said, you know, how do I go inside this prison and how do I empower a young man at 17 years old that is starting a journey of his life to serve 40 years in prison? How do I motivate him to take advantage of the opportunities that helps victimizers? See, sometimes victimizers are just as weak as the victims. And the victimizers don't know where to go for the answers to release the pain that they have inside. And as me being a victimizer, I didn't know. I didn't know what I was going through. I didn't know the impact that I had on people's lives and on my family lives. See, when I became a victimizer, I created victims in my life, in my family. And sharing my story can be touching and powerful because I also seen my best friend that I was involved into the lifestyle die. I watched him take his last breath. He was only 20 years old. And he was a victimizer of crime, but he was also a victim of crime. And to know that he never had the opportunity to be living right now because of decisions that we made as adolescents is hurting to me because I'm here living and I'm here doing, I believe that it's my purpose. I believe that prison changed my life because if I wasn't in prison, I probably wouldn't be here right now. I probably would have been dead myself or the road that I was going through. I thank my college professor, Angela Bryant from The Ohio State University, to be a mentor, to help me and guide me through that. Because sometimes people don't understand that the victimizer that's incarcerated don't feel like they have hope because their family members or friends are still victimizers. So you have to come out of prison or you have to come out of an incarcerated situation and be back into that lifestyle. How do you adapt? You know, I was telling her today, I said, you know, I built up a lot of courage to tell my story. I built up a lot of courage to do the things that I'm doing here in the community. At a point in time in Columbus, Ohio, I was a menace to society. And now I'm a blessing to the community by empowering and motivating people to overcome their stigma, overcome the prey of being a victimizer or becoming the prey of a victim.
That's passion.
Thank you.
That's passion.
Anybody have anything to add, or should we open it up to questions?
I want to say that I think he's case in point why, number one, we talk about victim to survivor, that's a survivor. That's someone who's looked at his situation and decided to change it, and not only change his own situation, but wants to change it for everyone else. And the other thing is that's why we have the system that we do, why I have to be empathetic, not compassionate sometimes, is because you have to be aware. There have been times when I've done a domestic violence case and the perpetrator just doesn't seem to get it, but you see something in them and you say, well, let me ask you this. You said you have a daughter. is this what you want for your daughter? When your daughter grows up, do you want her to be in court where your wife is right now doing what we're doing? And sometimes it just takes that realization to make some changes. When we were training officers on how to get information, it was the realization that, yes, you think of the domestic violence victim and you think about the perpetrator, but are there children in the household? Have they been, for the last 10 years of their lives, seeing this, thinking this is normal, anticipating that this is the way their lives are going to be? When you're getting information from them, don't tower over them like mom or dad. Get on their level and get the information, and realize the reason you're making this arrest to try to make this change is not just for the two people that you may be called back on 5 or 6 times, but because they have a son and daughter who you might have the ability to affect a change in their life before they adopt this as something that they expect in their futures as adults. So I just want to applaud him, first of all, from going from being a victim to being a survivor. I think that's amazing.
Thank you for sharing your story, Terry. Thank you. Did we have a question?
I had a question about.
I'm going to have to ask. Could you come up here, please? Thank you. Thank you.
I really wanted to know what your roles are with first responders. I had a friend who was raped, and the policeman that came there asked her, somebody had invaded her house, raped her, and he said, "Why don't you have a man in the house?" And she was telling me, wait a minute, this was a man, and she didn't see him because she had taken her glasses off, and she wasn't able to do it. And yet, I was a victim of stalking, and I had great responses from the police department, much more than I really anticipated. And so I just wondered, I know you said, the judge was saying something about working with the police, but those first responders being so important, I just wondered what your roles would be.
Generally, my contact with them is when they are in court, but I know that some of the funding that we've been talking about is towards training. So officers at roll call, the stalking, those are people that work with us. So officers at roll call are advised who to call to get someone who specializes in this involved. Unfortunately, I think for your friend, perhaps she had a street officer as her first contact, not the detective that had the training on how to deal with and not re-victimize a victim. And all I can suggest is that we keep training them, that we keep giving them the information on how to deal with people, not as a report or paperwork.
If I may be helpful, I'm a person who sits on the Ohio Police Officers Training Academy Crime Victims' Rights portion of what law enforcement's trained. And one thing to keep in mind is that curriculum is constantly looked at and updated, and that there are training hours specifically, so that officer should have known what to do. But I agree with the judge. It is an issue of training, and that shouldn't have happened.
Well, I was a nurse, and I know a lot of domestic violence happen within those families or the police. So that sometimes we're getting bounce back from what has been going on with them. And listening to one of the recent cases, they were saying the police was beating on the girl down in Texas because he had gone through some type of crisis just before that. So you're wondering, what do you do? What do you do here to keep this other victim from happening? Because that girl became a victim of that policeman because he apparently felt victimized by his work. So that's what I was wondering.
That's the whole issue of being able to insulate yourself to your profession. And you've said it a number of times today about compassion versus empathy. I mean, we can broaden that out, extend that out a little, and talk about the fact that we need to be very careful when we're helping others, not to bring an effort out towards them that's going to harm them more than help them.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to end the session by reminding everybody that we have another Lunch and Learn coming up on June 10th. Again, the focus is compassion, and we will be talking about volunteers in our community. Again, there is a resource table in the back. As Judge Peoples had asked, please assure that you take some of the information. There are also surveys that I'd like to ask that you complete if possible, and a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much for your time.